He was ordered to leave the carpeted area, warned not to touch the glass doors, called suspicious for sitting too still, and laughed at for thinking a black man like him could possibly have business on the executive floor, all while the billion-dollar acquisition they were waiting on couldn't move forward without his signature. No one asked why he was there. They just saw his skin, his silence, and assumed inferiority. For 4 hours, he was profiled, excluded, and reduced to a threat, until one moment flipped the entire building into panic. This story isn't about mistaken identity. It's about the cruelty of certainty, the price of prejudice, and what happens when the man you tried to humiliate turns out to be the one who owns your future. If that hits you, hit like. Subscribe for more true stories with power and consequence. And comment, what would you have done and where are you watching from? It was a crisp Monday morning when Malcolm Reed stepped into the towering lobby of Wesley Capital's headquarters, the kind of lobby designed to intimidate. Everything from the marble floors to the backlit artwork on the walls whispered wealth, but none of it fazed him. He walked with the subtle composure of someone who knew the value of silence, who had long since learned that power rarely had to announce itself. Dressed in a dark wool coat over a charcoal gray suit, he looked like any other high-level executive, except he was black, and that changed everything. The receptionist barely glanced up as he approached. Instead of greeting him, she slid a clipboard across the desk with a curt nod toward a blank sign-in sheet, without so much as asking who he was. He signed without comment and calmly asked for directions to the 47th floor. Her brow furrowed. She pecked a few keys, then said she couldn't find his name. She suggested he might be in the wrong place and gestured toward the back of the building, implying he was likely there for a delivery. He kept his expression flat and handed her a gold-embossed envelope. She didn't touch it. Instead, she motioned to a narrow metal bench near the entrance, far from the plush seating meant for clients. "That area's for guests with appointments," she said, and turned her eyes back to her monitor, as if the conversation had ended. Malcolm took a seat where she'd indicated, back straight, hands resting on his knees. From there, he observed everything. The polite greetings offered to white clients, the sparkling water trays carried past him without pause, the subtle but unmistakable shift in posture whenever someone noticed him sitting near the door. A security guard walked by, twice. The first time he said nothing, just watched. For the second time, he asked whether Malcolm was lost or waiting for someone from maintenance. Malcolm replied simply that he had a 9:30 meeting on the 47th floor. The guard blinked and muttered something about protocol. Moments later, the receptionist whispered something to the guard, her eyes never leaving her screen. The guard returned, this time standing closer. He asked to see ID. Malcolm showed it without protest. He was used to this. He knew that wearing the right suit, arriving early, and carrying the proper documents didn't shield him from suspicion when his skin alone invited doubt. More visitors arrived. A man in khakis and a wrinkled button-down walked straight in and was greeted by name, handed a pass, and escorted upstairs without delay. Another woman with no visible appointment was offered coffee and invited to wait in the guest lounge. No one offered Malcolm anything. At one point, he overheard a junior associate whispering to a colleague that someone had been loitering by the front doors for a while. They glanced at him, then returned to their conversation with disinterest. It wasn't the words that stung, it was the tone. Like he was invisible until he became inconvenient. He shifted in his seat, glanced at the clock. 9:25. 5 minutes until his meeting. Still no call, no acknowledgement, no invitation upstairs. He knew exactly what was happening, and still he waited. He wasn't here, he was here to remember. At 9:31, Arlo Jackson himself exited the elevator with 2 board members, laughing loudly about a recent merger. He passed right by Malcolm without so much as a glance. Arlo pulled out his phone and murmured something about a no-show client. Malcolm stood slowly, adjusted his sleeves, and took a step forward. But before he could speak, the receptionist spoke without looking up. "Sir, we're asking you to wait near the entrance or return later. They're not available now." Her voice was flat, her words final. The security guard stepped forward slightly, as if ready to escort him out. Malcolm didn't argue. To any casual observer, he was simply another man out of place, sitting too still, not moving fast enough to belong. People continued to pass through the revolving doors, some glancing, most ignoring him entirely. He wasn't loud, wasn't moving. wasn't causing any disruption, and yet the tension he stirred in a young associate, perhaps an intern or fresh hire, approached with a nervous energy, gripping a folder like a lifeline. He squinted toward Malcolm and asked in an overly loud voice if he was looking for the maintenance office. Malcolm didn't respond immediately. The associate's eyes scanned his coat, then dropped to the leather gloves resting neatly beside him on the bench. His posture shifted. "Oh, sorry," he added, laughing awkwardly, "just making sure." He looked. The tone was meant to sound polite, but beneath it there was an unmistakable current of assumption. Assumption that a black man sitting quietly in a corporate lobby couldn't possibly be there for any legitimate reason other than custodial work. Malcolm gave a nod, subtle and unreadable, and returned his gaze to the front desk. The associate, clearly unsettled by the silence, walked away quickly, whispering into his phone within seconds. From the security station near the side entrance, the guard who had earlier requested Malcolm's ID now sat more alert, one hand near the silent alarm button installed beneath his desk. He didn't press it immediately. Instead, he watched closely as Malcolm reached into his coat pocket, retrieving his phone to check the time. It was 9:38 still, no invitation upstairs, still no acknowledgement. He scrolled briefly, verifying the confirmation email once more. At that moment, the guard leaned slightly forward and pressed the silent internal alert. Nothing loud, nothing obvious, but upstairs, in the building's security office, a quiet notification appeared. In unverified personnel maintained possible surveillance. The label was pre-written, built into the system. The implication was clear. A black man on a phone in a corporate space was automatically suspicious, even when doing nothing more than waiting. Back at the reception desk, the young woman tapped away at her keyboard, eyes darting up every few moments, as if hoping Malcolm would simply disappear. Her hand brushed against the small headset in her ear, confirming she'd received the alert as well. Across the lobby, a few mid-level managers were now staring, not overtly, not enough to signal curiosity laced with discomfort. Malcolm noticed. Of course, he noticed. He always noticed. These moments, this choreography of prejudice, it was never random, it always followed a rhythm, and today, it played out with precise timing. The janitorial staff passed through briefly, a man with a floor polisher and a woman wheeling a cart of cleaning supplies. Neither looked at Malcolm, but one of the managers did, a sideways glance followed by a quick whisper to a colleague. They both nodded, one of them smirked. It was now 9:45. Malcolm stood briefly, stretched his legs, then returned to the bench. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. The guard rose from his chair and casually approached, this time asking if Malcolm needed help locating a different office. "You've been sitting a while," he said. "We just want to make sure everything's all right." His voice was firm but veiled in civility. Malcolm calmly responded that he was still waiting for his appointment. The guard didn't push further, but didn't retreat either. He remained nearby, posture alert. One more wrong move, one unexpected reach for a pocket, one step in the wrong direction, and the tone would shift. The subtlety of the discrimination wasn't in shouting or slurs, it was in the unspoken language of suspicion. It was in the way Malcolm was asked if he was lost when he had clear purpose. It was in how a phone in his hand became a perceived threat. It was in every glance, every whisper, every hesitation. No one raised their voice, no one said the wrong thing, but everything was wrong. The company had built a space of modern architecture and inclusive slogans, but none of it mattered when the moment of truth arrived. In the operations office on the third floor, a junior executive assistant named Devin Mars sat at his desk scrolling through the meeting board. He had noticed Malcolm from the cameras downstairs and recognized neither the man's face nor name. Devin, always eager to prove initiative, decided to clean up what he assumed was a scheduling error, seeing the meeting listed under Mr. Arlo Jackson's name with Kestrel Partners and the read. He clicked into the booking interface, skimmed it without reading the attached documents, and quietly deleted the entry. No notice sent, no confirmation needed. In his mind, he'd just erased a phantom glitch, a misfire in the system. He'd done the company a favor. He leaned back in his chair and messaged his supervisor, saying someone suspicious had arrived, claiming to have a meeting but no appointment existed anymore. Upstairs, that simple act created a ripple that redefined the situation. Downstairs, Malcolm remained where he was, unaware his digital existence within the company's network had just been scrubbed away by a stranger with no authority to question his presence. That erasure gave the receptionist new confidence. When Malcolm stood and calmly approached again, asking if a manager might help resolve what was likely a clerical mix-up, she didn't check the schedule. She didn't call anyone. She pointed to a nearby corner with steel there and said, "The guest lounge is reserved for clients. These seats are for general visitors." Malcolm glanced at the area she referred to. The same drafty space with no refreshments, no decor, and now no dignity. The actual guest lounge, just a few feet further in, held 3 leather sofas arranged around a marble coffee table with sparkling water in glass mugs. But no, he wasn't permitted there. The receptionist offered a dry explanation. The cushions in that room absorb smell too easily. Company policy. Better to avoid potential complaints from other guests. Malcolm didn't argue. He returned to the metal chair and remained as still as ever. His silence made others nervous. It left too much room for projection. A few employees passed by with tray carts and office supplies, all carefully avoiding eye contact. Meanwhile, the group chat on the internal communications app started to light up. A message had been shared. No photos yet, but enough description to inflame bias. In less than 5 minutes, the narrative had shifted from unidentified guest to stubborn intruder. And so the whispers began to grow legs. From floor to floor, department to department, more staff began to hear about the man downstairs who claimed he was supposed to meet Arlo Jackson. Someone joked that he was trying to sneak into the boardroom to pitch a GoFundMe. Another chimed in that maybe he thought this was the DMV, and while no one explicitly said it, they all knew what made the story believable. It wasn't that he had no appointment. It was that he looked like he didn't belong. Looked like what? That question was never asked, but the answer sat on that steel bench, hands folded, expression unreadable. Malcolm wasn't naive. He could sense the shift. He saw it in how the staff spoke to one another in shorter sentences, how the security guard stayed closer, how the receptionist no longer even pretended to check. The system. He watched as a delivery man, white, in a hoodie, holding a box, was let through to the back office without even stating his name. The patterns were clear. The system was not broken. It was performing exactly as it was built to perform. At 10:07 he stood again, not because he was tired, but because the performance around him had become too loud to ignore. He walked calmly to the reception counter and asked if he could wait in the client lounge while things were sorted. The receptionist raised her eyes just high enough to acknowledge him, then glanced toward the security desk. She said, "That area's reserved." Conversations began to swell, just loud enough to be heard. A trio of junior staffers gathered near the espresso station positioned by the lounge that had been denied to him. They weren't whispering anymore. They were openly criticizing the company's recent diversity policies, cloaking their words in bureaucratic terms but letting their real meaning bleed through. One of them said the company's recent push for representation had led to a flood of candidates who didn't fit the brand image. Another, sipping overpriced cold brew, added that not everyone in a suit deserved a seat at the table. Their words floated into the open air, intentionally unfiltered, clearly timed to coincide with Malcolm stretching his legs a few feet away. They didn't look at him directly, but every sentence was a dart meant to pierce. He didn't respond. Instead, he walked calmly toward the guest room nearby and noticed something new taped to the interior door of the lounge just across the hallway. A laminated notice, freshly added, sat crookedly on the glass. It was a standard operations alert about company property and caution, but someone had scribbled something on the bottom corner with a red pen. Careful with strangers in this area, previous incidents with stolen phones. The intricacy ensues, with stoppy punctually sloppy. Malcolm stared at the words, then returned to his seat, not because he was resigned, but because every moment he stayed revealed a little more of what lay beneath the polish. Around 10:20, a group of middle managers walked into the lobby, headed for a meeting upstairs. They didn't greet him. They paused, read the scribbled note through the glass, and one of them chuckled softly, as if in private agreement. This wasn't a workplace at that moment. It was theater, and the roles were cast by stereotype. Malcolm reached into his pocket and pulled out a notepad, jotting down timestamps, faces, and phrases. No longer checking his watch, now he was logging, cataloging. documenting not just the words but the structure that gave them space to thrive. He had sat in rooms before where this exact kind of culture was called high culture, was called high standards and exclusion painted as policy. But here, in this lobby, the mask wasn't just slipping, it had shattered. Another associate walked by, staring too long before pretending to check her phone. The security guard, still at his post, paced within visible range, no longer bothering to hide his attention. At 10:32, a staff member refilled the coffee bar and removed 2 extra chairs from the lounge, whispering something to the receptionist before leaving. More guests arrived. One of them, an older white man in a wrinkled blazer, approached the desk loudly demanding directions. He had no ID, no pass, no appointment. The receptionist hesitated, then allowed him to proceed after a brief smile and a check-in with no paperwork. He walked past Malcolm without acknowledging his presence. No suspicion followed him. No security hovered. No policy was invoked. Malcolm wrote again in his notepad. At 10:45, the group at the espresso bar dispersed, but their conversation remained in the air like smoke. "You can't just hand seats to people because of optics," one of them had said. "They need to earn it," another had added. "This isn't a charity boardroom." And though no one named Malcolm, they all circled his existence without ever addressing it. He was the ghost they spoke around. The receptionist glanced toward him less and less frequently, as if pretending he wasn't there could erase her complicity in the subtle but deliberate push to exclude him from everything the building promised on its polished brochures. At 10:51, he stood again and calmly approached the desk, requesting to speak with a manager. Her response came with the artificial patience of someone reading a script. "One moment, sir." She picked up the phone, dialed an internal extension, and waited, her voice lowered to a murmur. Then she nodded, hung up, and looked at Malcolm with flat professionalism. "I'm afraid all our senior staff are off-site at an all-day strategy summit. There's no one available to meet you at the moment. You're welcome to wait, but I cannot promise when they'll return." Her tone was so neutral it became hostile. The lie was clear, but it was polished, practiced, undeniable. Malcolm offered no reaction. He stepped back, noted the time, and returned to his bench. At 10:58, a white man in his early 40s, Mr. Lowry, walked past Malcolm without a glance, and the security guard stepped aside without hesitation to press the elevator button for him. The 2 doors slid open, golden and quiet, sealing the moment in silence. Malcolm, still seated in the same corner, watched without blinking. By 11:03, the building had decided he no longer existed. No one approached. No one offered assistance. The digital guest log showed no mention of him. The internal message board continued circulating the false narrative that someone had wandered into the lobby under false pretenses and refused to leave. One junior staffer even speculated in group chat that the man might be a disgruntled former employee seeking a payout. Another replied with a laughing emoji and a warning to avoid contact. They didn't know who he was. They didn't want to know. Their entire response was not built on information, it was built on reaction. And the reaction had hardened into policy. At 11:15, Malcolm requested again, this time not for a manager but simply for someone from corporate communications or public affairs, anyone authorized to speak on behalf of the company. The receptionist shook her head. "I'm not authorized to give out internal contacts. Without an appointment in the system, I can't escalate your request." She paused, then added, "I can provide an email address if you'd like to try again another day." Malcolm didn't answer. He didn't take the paper she offered. He turned, scanned the room again, and noted the newest detail. 2 men in maintenance uniforms standing near the freight entrance, whispering and looking in his direction. Their stance was relaxed, but their eyes weren't. At 11:26, another guest entered the building, an older woman, in athletic wear, with no appointment listed. She approached the desk hesitantly, saying she was there to pick up a donation envelope from finance. Within 2 minutes, she was escorted upstairs by an intern. No hesitation, no questions. Meanwhile, Malcolm, completing her completed weeks prior, remained on a cold bench surrounded by invisible walls. This wasn't disorganization. It wasn't error. It was execution. A system designed to deny access not with force, but with silence, deflection, and erasure. By 11:35, the receptionist stopped pretending. Her eye contact vanished. her tone chilled to pure function. Her phone rang, and she answered with mechanical brightness for other guests, while Malcolm was no longer acknowledged. The guard remained in place, arms folded, positioned slightly to the side of Malcolm's chair, not blocking him directly, but always watching. No one said leave, but everything about the air, the posture, the glances, said you do not belong here. And Malcolm, knowing exactly what that meant, did not leave. He kept sitting, he kept noting, he kept remembering. He opened it with steady hands and began reviewing documents. Not to prove anything, not to attract attention, but simply because it was time-sensitive work and because he, unlike the room around him, had a job to do. Within moments, subtle movement rippled through the lobby. A man walking past in a blazer and company lanyard did a double take, slowed his steps, and then approached Malcolm with a curious but wary tone. "Is this a restricted area?" he asked, his eyes not on Malcolm but on the folder. Malcolm didn't respond. The man added, "Just making sure. Confidential materials aren't usually reviewed in open spaces, especially near exits." The implication wasn't a question. It was an accusation softened by protocol. Malcolm closed the folder calmly and placed it on his lap. The man lingered for another second before retreating, already typing something into his phone. The receptionist didn't move, but her eyes tracked the folder now. The security guard shifted his stance slightly closer. In another part of the lobby, a younger staffer, barely out of college by the look of his nervous energy, whispered to a colleague that he thought someone should document this. "Maybe take a photo, just in case," he said. "You never know who's pretending these days." The colleague hesitated, unsure whether to agree out loud, but didn't object. The younger staffer pulled out his phone and, under the pretense of checking email, angled the camera in Malcolm's direction. He didn't press the shutter, not yet, but the intent had already written itself into the air. At 11:42, Malcolm placed the folder back in his coat and returned to stillness. The entire lobby now responded to his every movement with a hum of low-grade paranoia. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't stand, he didn't even speak. But the mere act of reading a document had triggered the room's reflex to categorize, contain, and confirm. Behind the front desk, the receptionist typed a several message to the internal chat thread. "Unknown visitor still on premises. Reviewing documents, possibly unauthorized. Requesting confirmation." Within seconds, responses returned, half serious, half laced with mockery. "Should we check his LinkedIn?" someone wrote. Another joked, "Maybe he's a blogger doing undercover exposés." One more added, "Or he's lost and pretending to be a consultant. Call security just in case." Though no one laughed aloud, the smirks around the room were synchronized. At 11:49, a supervisor from facilities stepped out from the employee corridor and walked toward the reception desk. He didn't look at Malcolm directly, but asked quietly whether the man had been vetted. The receptionist shrugged and handed him a slip of paper. The supervisor folded it without reading and left. His presence was symbolic, a subtle reminder that hierarchy existed to decide who belonged and who didn't, and today it had chosen to observe rather than engage. A few minutes later, the young staffer who had suggested the photo finally snapped a blurry image and sent it to the group chat. "Just in case," he captioned. Still, no one confronted Malcolm. No one asked him to leave. They only built the cage tighter around him with silence and surveillance. At 11:56, Malcolm remained unmoved. He knew the steps of this dance. He'd seen how institutions reacted not to aggression but to dignity, how composure disrupted the hierarchy more than protest. He understood that his refusal to be rattled, to be anything other than prepared and professional, was the very thing that threatened their structure. The building itself had become a machine, designed to reject what it didn't understand or refuse to respect. But Malcolm knew machines. He had built stronger ones. And now, all he had to do was let this one overheat itself. As she neared the counter, her eyes moved past the receptionist, scanned the waiting area, and locked onto Malcolm. The folder in her hands dropped a fraction of an inch. Her posture stiffened. For a second too long, she stood frozen, blinking as if her mind couldn't process what her eyes were telling her. It wasn't confusion, it was recognition, and it landed like a punch to the chest. She knew exactly who he was. Laura Benning, Senior VP of Global Acquisitions, had seen Malcolm Reed only once before, in a closed-door boardroom in Zurich, where he had walked away from a $10 billion merger that ultimately triggered the collapse of an entire European fintech firm. She had witnessed firsthand what happened when Malcolm Reed said no, and now, inexplicably, he was sitting on a bench in her lobby, coat folded neatly, eyes calm and unreadable, as if the entire world around him had not been, treating him like a stranger for over 3 hours. At 12:07, Malcolm stood. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down beside his bench and lifted the black briefcase that had been untouched all morning. The logo etched into its corner caught the light for the first time. Sterling Venture Holdings. It was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who mattered. Sterling Venture wasn't just a name. It was the controlling stake behind nearly $30 billion in active assets and one of the most elusive players in active. Only a handful of people in the building even knew that Sterling Venture had recently entered negotiations with Wacth Capital, and none of them had been informed who was leading the deal. Malcolm adjusted the latch on the briefcase, took one step toward the reception desk and placed it on the counter. The sound of metal meeting marble was soft but sharp enough to make the receptionist look. At that moment, the lobby shifted. The receptionist's breath hitched. A junior analyst standing nearby paused mid-conversation. The security guard took one small step back. The illusion cracked. This wasn't an intruder. This wasn't a lost visitor. This was the person the entire floor had been trying to impress, exclude, or ignore. In less than 10 seconds, the hierarchy that had operated with such casual cruelty all morning began to buckle. The receptionist opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Her eyes searched the paper for an error, a forgery, something that could protect her from what she was now seeing. But there was nothing to deny. Her silence became confession. At 12:13, the executive elevator opened, and Laura stepped out again, this time with 3 members of the leadership team behind her, each scanning the lobby for the anticipated courier who had yet to arrive. Laura pointed silently at Malcolm. One of the men, a tall gray-haired partner with a firm jawline, tilted his head in surprise, then in embarrassment. Nora whispered something that sounded like, "That's him?" and the third, recognizing the insignia on the briefcase, paled. They began to walk toward him, but Malcolm had already closed the case. He didn't step away. He didn't look up. He waited. Because for the first time all day, the room had remembered how to see. Laura Benning reached him first, her face struggling to settle between professionalism and panic. And before she could utter a single word, the glass doors at the front entrance opened again. A tall woman in an ash-gray coat stepped through briskly, carrying a slim leather folio. She walked straight to Malcolm, handed him the document without hesitation, and greeted him with the tone reserved only for billion-dollar decisions. The receptionist instinctively stood up, then sat back down. The leather folio bore the same emblem as Malcolm's briefcase, and when he opened it, he revealed the final clause package of the acquisition deal. The title page read, "Sterling Venture Holdings Proposed Majority Stake in Wacth Capital Final." For him, the room turned to glass. Everyone could see everything now, but no one could undo what had already been said, done, or deleted. Malcolm glanced briefly over the signatures on the final page. Jackson's name already printed and signed in blue ink. The deal had advanced far enough that the board had already committed. They just didn't know they'd failed the vetting process. Laura began to speak, her mouth forming. They started, damn. Instead, he turned toward the reception counter and handed the document back to his assistant, who stepped aside silently. Then, at 12:22, the unexpected happened. The main digital display in the lobby, the same screen that had spent the morning showing elevator wait times, company slogans, and shareholder updates, clashed, flickered, and changed to a breaking news alert. A live broadcast began playing silently, subtitles scrolling below the footage. A business reporter was seated in a bright studio, speaking into the camera with measured excitement. The chyron beneath her read, "Beth Inventia CEO Malcolm Reed finalizes terms on Wacth Capital acquisition." And then came the photo. It filled the screen in high resolution. Malcolm, in a boardroom weeks earlier, seated at the head of a long oak table, his hand resting on a stack of documents, flanked by advisors, his face unmistakable, his posture calm, his authority absolute. The silence in the lobby cracked. A receptionist gasped involuntarily. A junior analyst near the coffee cart dropped his ceramic mug. A partner who had only just arrived froze mid-stride as the color drained from his face. The guard by the door, who had been subtly monitoring Malcolm all morning, now took an imperceptible step backward. As if proximity itself had become dangerous, the people who had laughed, speculated, texted, and condescended, the man whose presence had been treated as a disruption was, in fact, the owner of the room they stood in. The briefcase wasn't a prop, the folder wasn't a bluff, and the silence wasn't passivity. It had been observation. At 12:26, Malcolm took a single step toward the executive elevator, and the crowd instinctively parted. No one blocked his way, no one asked for identification, no one dared offer help. He didn't acknowledge the display screen, but everyone else couldn't look away. The live ticker at the bottom of the screen now detailed that Reed's firm would assume controlling interest pending final review, subject to approval by the Sterling Vent. The emphasis hung in the air like a blade. Approval pending. It was no longer up to Wesley Capital to grant or deny anything. He walked slowly, deliberately, with the same calm rhythm he had maintained since the moment he entered the building. But now, every step landed with the force of authority that couldn't be ignored. No badge could deny it. No receptionist could redirect it. No whispered chat could erase it. The very same people who had pushed him to the margins now watched him with reverence, rooted in panic, their minds racing through every word they had said that morning, every gesture of dismissal, every assumption cloaked in professionalism. But it was too late to rewrite the morning. The tape had been rolling the entire time. Executives who had tried to shield themselves behind policy now stood near the coffee bar, not drinking, not talking, just waiting to see what he would do next. They weren't hoping for forgiveness, they were hoping for delay, for time to explain before consequences hardened into history. But Malcolm didn't speak. He reached into his coat, pulled out his phone, scrolled briefly, and made a call. No one knew who he was calling, but everyone understood the weight of it. The screen above the lobby flashed again. A new update from business networks reported that Sterling Venture Holdings had just paused the acquisition process. The ticker read, "Deal on hold, strategic review initiated by Reed leadership." For a few seconds, the building held still, as if even the HVAC system paused in collective disbelief. At 12:37, Malcolm exited the elevator without ever going upstairs. He didn't need to. He had come not to negotiate but to observe, to test the character of a company before deciding its fate. And it had failed the test before lunch. He walked to the center of the lobby and stood still, not speaking, simply watching the weight of his silence work harder than any confrontation ever could. His assistant stepped back in with a second folder, one stamped with a different crest, Braylock Equity Group. It was Wesley Capital's largest competitor, and the firm that had, until recently, been a distant second in the race for his firm's partnership. Malcolm took the folder, opened it briefly, and nodded once. That small motion broke the dam. Within minutes, phones rang across the executive floor. Board members, suddenly aware of the shift, scrambled for answers. The receptionist received a message on her screen, full panic mode. A junior manager stepped forward, attempted to approach Malcolm with a fabricated sense of ease, but turned away before even making eye contact. At 12:43, the story broke across social media. A financial insider posted a timeline of the lobby incident, complete with anonymized quotes from the company's own internal chat logs. Within 20 minutes, hashtags exploded across platforms. Reed was watching. Tens of thousands of users began sharing the image from the earlier newsfeed. Malcolm seated calmly, arms folded beneath the glowing company crest. But now that image had a caption. They thought he was nobody. He owned the room. Then the petitions began. A grassroots group of young professionals launched a campaign demanding Wesley Capital publicly disclose its internal DEI metrics, disciplinary policies, and security protocols. Over 30,000 signatures flooded in before the end of the hour. News anchors debated the ethics of image-based profiling in corporate spaces. A whistleblower leaked the internal security footage. Media outlets ran the footage side by side with company promotional videos, claiming inclusivity, showing the contradiction in real time. The damage was viral, not because Malcolm exposed them, but because they exposed themselves. At 12:58, Malcolm left the building, without saying a single word to the people now desperate to speak. His car arrived, the door opened, and he entered without hesitation. Behind him, the lobby stood hollow not because of architecture but because its core had collapsed. A press release from Sterling Venture appeared online moments later, stating that the firm would redirect strategic resources to partnerships that reflect values beyond capital alignment. Though the statement didn't name Wesley, no one had doubts. Braylock's stocks surged within minutes. Wesley's shares dipped sharply, wiping millions in market value before 1:00 p.m. And still, no one in the building spoke Malcolm's name out loud. Not yet. Shame had made it too heavy. By 1:05 p.m., the story had reached national television. A panel of analysts, diversity advocates, and leadership consultants dissected what had happened. The consensus was brutal. The mistake wasn't just racism, or exclusion, or gatekeeping. It was the arrogance to believe that those things could still go unnoticed in a world that now records everything, even silence. By 9:00 the next morning, the lobby of Wesley Capital was quieter than usual, not because business had slowed, but because something inside the company had shifted. There were no jokes near the espresso machine, no casual gossip floating through the air. The receptionist sat straighter than usual, her eyes no longer scanning but searching, as if expecting someone to return and rewrite the past. The security guard had been reassigned. Overnight, the lobby had been rearranged, the metal bench replaced by a velvet-cushioned seat near the center wall. Subtle, but deliberate. But Malcolm Reed wasn't coming back for revenge. He had already made his statement, not through confrontation but through consequence. What remained now was what the building chose to do with its silence. At 10:13, a post appeared on the company's internal network, an open letter written by Lance Dorman, the operations manager who had first questioned Malcolm's presence that morning. The letter was not defensive. It didn't hide behind policies or chain of command. It simply read, "I saw a man and I judged him based on every wrong thing I've ever internalized. I thought I was upholding standards, but I was protecting fear." He went on to describe the moment he saw the news broadcast, the instant his stomach dropped, and how his silence in the lobby echoed louder in his memory than anything he could now say. The letter concluded with a promise, to listen differently, to unlearn publicly, and to stop hiding behind the comfort of plausible deniability. For the first time in years, a company-wide post received thousands of genuine responses. Not emojis, not formality, but actual words. Staff who had never spoken openly about internal culture added their stories. Even those who had been complicit without realizing it shared how they had chosen not to. By noon, the board of Wesley Capital had convened an emergency meeting, not to salvage a deal, but to confront a culture. They didn't release a vague press statement. Instead, they published a detailed, transparent internal memo outlining 3 sweeping changes. First, a full audit of hiring, retention, and promotion practices would be conducted by a third party with results made public. Second, all employees from entry-level to C-suite would undergo racial equity training, designed not by corporate consultants, but by community leaders with lived experience. And third, they extended an invitation, not a request, to Malcolm Reed to oversee and overhold them accountable. Most assumed he would decline, but that afternoon, Malcolm issued a brief statement through his office. "Change only matters when it survives the spotlight. I accept, not to validate but to verify." The message landed harder than any condemnation. It was the signature of someone who understood that justice wasn't just a response to damage, but a blueprint for repair. In the weeks that followed, the story moved beyond headlines. Malcolm didn't return to the building, but his influence shaped what rose from the rubble. Wesley's competitors began reviewing their own access protocols. Other executives stepped forward, not to defend, but to disclose. One even admitted they had created a visual vetting list for security that no one had challenged until now. The reckoning didn't stop with the signature, it multiplied. At a public forum on ethical investment, Malcolm stood on stage with other black leaders in finance, sharing not his anger, but his expectation, not to be welcomed, but to be recognized without exception. The applause was not for his words, but for his restraint. By the end of the quarter, Wesley Capital had implemented its promised reforms. The new mentorship program paired junior staff from marginalized backgrounds with senior leadership for long-term development. The receptionist from that day had quietly resigned. Lance, however, remained. But not as a manager. He had requested a demotion, choosing instead to work on internal training initiatives, starting with his own. He spoke at schools, wrote op-eds, and began hosting weekly sessions titled Seeing Without Filters. People listened, not because he claimed to be changed, but because he knew he never could be, unless others held him to it. In the end. If this story made you pause, reflect, or even feel something unexpected, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more true-to-life narratives with powerful twists. Which moment shocked you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know in the comments.